Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm on today with a bit of Orange. You can use your real name if you want, but you don't have to. Um, and I'm sure a lot of you know about him. He's been in fist fights with both Vice Rhino and Professor Stick. Uh,
Fisticuffs.
Fisticuffs, yeah. Um, and so now I've got him on, and we get to talk. Actually, I forgot to ask. Have you done other hangouts like this before?
Um, I have, but not with someone who disagrees with me. So this is a nice change of pace.
Okay, so I'm your first, is what you're saying?
Yes, you get to be the first to take a direct swing at me. Fisticuffs.
Oh well, I'm sure this will be much more uh humane and sanitary than fisticuffs.
That's good. I just did my nails. I'd hate to break them.
Anyways, so since you are the guest on this show, I will let you speak for yourself. You can introduce yourself as you want and articulate your position. So I give you the floor. Hello, Orange. Can you hear me? Hello. Uh-oh. I can't hear you. If you're still there. Uh-oh. Well, we seem to have lost Orange's sound for the moment. Unless it's my sound. Can you guys in the audience hear me? Uh-oh. I don't know what's going on. Okay, so you guys hear me fine, but I can't hear Orange. Uh, uh-oh. That's not good. Well, that sucks. Well, I guess we'll wait for him to come back. Um, in a moment. Let's see. See if I can ask him to try entering again. So, in the meantime, okay. So in the meantime, uh, yeah, I actually have done a video about Orange. Well, RJ and I and a few others did a talk about Orange, and uh, I think Matt Powell also mentioned him. And so I'm interested really to know about the sources that Orange reads, and I'll ask him about that, RJ, just for you. The topic will be about evolutionary biology. We're going to talk about uh, definitions of evolution, mutations, mechanisms, things like that. Um, but then I did a video. Uh, I did a little video about Orange for Anti-Ordinary, and I put it on my channel recently. And so, if you want to see, uh, if you want to see that, you can go check it out. I might put it in the description if I remember. Um, da, 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 da. So, I hope you're all doing well. I'll just try to get back in touch with him because it's I don't he's not on email right now. So let me see if he's on Skype or something. I just don't know what happened. You know, technology, I'm surprised it works at all, as RJ says. Um it should be an interesting talk. I'm very excited to talk to him since I didn't get to in June. He got sick. And so yeah, I'm excited to talk to him. And we'll see how it goes. I think it should be fine. Let me take a look. I don't know. RJ, why don't you come in until he returns? You raptured? I don't know. It's a good question. We'll see what happens. Let's see. I'm going to bring RJ in and we'll just chat about stuff until we get Orange back up and running. How about that? I couldn't have kicked him out for telling the truth. We hadn't even talked about anything. So, okay. Yeah. I know. I'm trying to hand it to you, RJ. Give me a sec. Slow computer. There you go. So, if it goes on for too much longer, I can always just power this one down and then start it back up again whenever we get him on. No, he didn't mute himself. He's not even in the chat. Hello? And so, if any of you can see it, I got a phylogenetic tree poster up here in the background. It's from Useful Charts. It's a really interesting little thing. It's kind of neat. Some of it's a bit dated, but it covers a whole lot of stuff. It even covers the reptile mammal transition just for RJ. Howdy, everybody.
Am I back?
There you are. Hey, how you doing?
I'm so sorry. I have no idea what happened. Everything just froze up. You went silent, and my computer wouldn't respond. So I've been anxiously trying to get one of my two computers to turn on. Sorry, everyone.
Oh, that's okay. Don't worry about it. I mean,
I'll start to the conversation.
As RJ says, I'm surprised technology works at all. So, you know. But
so what did I miss?
And I'll stay a quiet little mouse.
So, I was asking you, I said, so since you're my guest on, you know, I'll hand it over to you. You can tell the people a little bit about yourself and your position, and then we can go from there. So I give you the floor.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm Brian from A Bit of Orange over at abitoforange.com or youtube.com/abitoforange. I come with vitamin C, full of citrus goodness. Basically, my position is real simple. I am a Christian, and I am a young earth biblical creationist, which means that all of you are right now hearing, I'm a flat earther. That's not my position. My position is that the Bible is accurate and true, and it's not, in terms of the creation story in Genesis 1, that it is as literal as it's intended to be, meaning that God made the world in roughly a week, about 6,000 years ago. And my position is that in terms of evolution, when understood properly, it fails on its own merits. So to clarify, what a lot of people tend to hear when they hear creationist, they hear, Uncle Dad done told me that the Bible's true, so science is tools of rumination from the devil, and I ain't fixing to like it. And so evolution must be the devil because it disagrees with the Bible. That is not my position. First of all, I don't have an Uncle Dad. My position is that you do not need to come to the conversation with any presumptions of theology, biblical or otherwise, that if you just understand what it is Darwin is proposing with Darwinian evolution, and you look at the proposed mechanisms of Darwinian evolution, you will see that what is being proposed is not possible by any known mechanism. By any known mechanism? Wow, I talk English good. It's not possible by any proposed mechanism of Darwinian evolution or biological evolution, and that basically it fails on its own merits. But in order to start that journey, you have to come to a good understanding what evolution is. Because one of the things I find that people lack isn't definitions all across the board that disagree with each other, sometimes diametrically opposed to each other, but usually they're just kind of a hazy non-definition. like the most common definition you'll hear is evolution is just change over time. But if that's your definition and you hear me say evolution is false, what you're hearing me say is nothing ever changes. But that's stupid because everything changes over time. That's what it means to be in time. To be temporal is to change. So I have my minion sippy cup, so you can tell that I care about real science.
Oh.
So the thing that I want us to talk about first is...
I remember that one.
Don't get me started on a rabbit trail. I will talk about anything for... I'm very distractible.
Okay, all right, fair enough. So am I. Squirrel!
What was I saying?
Oh.
So the first thing I want to... Is somebody eating something?
RJ, turn your mic down or mute yourself.
Are you having lunch, RJ?
I'm sorry. I'll mute.
Okay.
RJ, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm in my jammies and eating breakfast.
Well, it is 11 where you are, so okay, fair enough. Okay, continue.
Can I get a quick introduction to who RJ is? Because I actually don't know why he's here.
Oh, in the brief time that you were gone, I wasn't sure if what was going to happen, if you were going to come back and we were going to, RJ and I were going to fill the space, just talking, just shooting crap.
He's just a friend of yours joining us for the conversation.
Oh, well, I mean, he's just going to sit there.
No, it's cool. I was just curious. I'm not, you know.
But yeah, he's a friend of mine. So we were just going to talk and fill the air. But then you came back. We were afraid you'd been raptured. And so
I thought I had been, but no, I'm still here. All right, give me a quick second to pull up my fabulous educational visuals, and if it's cool with you, we can start on the meandering conversation that is science. Are you ready?
Okay.
All right, I'm going to push this button and hope for the best. All right, you should be seeing you right now, I imagine. So I will find this button here. All right. Welcome to the Darwinian Tree of Life. Here is pictorially represented the history of all life on Earth according to Charles Chuck D. Darwin and his fabulous theory, which can be found in his 1859 blockbuster seller on Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, blah, 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 yakety schmackety. So this is where I like to start, because if you don't understand the story that evolution is intending to tell, it's hard to come up with a good definition of what it is. Again, you brought up Vice Rhino, and his definition, from what he said, you can watch the video that he posted, he defines evolution to be any genetic change between generations, which means, and again, he said this out loud, the fact that he is not an identical clone to his mother is evolution. Now, that's not how I define it, because in my opinion, in order to define Darwinian evolution so that it means what it's supposed to mean, it means Darwinian evolution, you have to consider this story here that evolution is intending to tell. You have to be able to explain the origin of species, and not just species, of course, but kinds and classes and phyla and all the different ways that we categorize life on Earth. So here is the Darwinian Tree of Life. Again, I'm just going to talk rapidly, so feel free to interrupt me if you have questions or comments.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so we start off with a rock, because at one point on Earth, according to this story, there was no life at all. There was rocks, and then it rained on the rocks for millions of years, and that turned into soup. Not necessarily Campbell brand, but you know, there's conflicting.
I know who you listen to just by that one sentence.
No, you don't. Anyone can say that.
Willing to bet I can make a wild guess. But anyways, continue.
I wouldn't be shocked if you got it right. I was just going to say there's conflicting fossil evidence as to what kind of soup it was.
There's no fossil evidence.
Yeah, what would fossil evidence look like?
So follow me here. This is the story of life on Earth.
So for for what I assume you're referring to, which is abiogenesis,
yeah,
what we're dealing with at that point are dealing with matters of geochemistry to biochemistry. So we honestly don't expect any fossils from that point, because we're dealing in terms of cellular reactions essentially. And so I don't know why we wouldn't expect any fossils of cellular reactions to be taking place. So there's no, it's not that there's no conflicting.
No, the fossil comment, I was just talking about what kind of soup it was, making a joke about the label because I'd made it Campbell soup.
It's not a joke.
Some people were Campbell, some were Progresso.
Don't you need to have an idea of what the fossils would look like? So describe what you would see, Brian, in the fossil record that would clue you in that there was a prebiotic process going on.
I'm sorry, you want me to know what kind of fossils I would expect to
For
show
that sort of process,
genesis?
yes. Yes.
Not much. I suppose
Right.
you would expect some kind of increasingly organic compositions in the lowest layers of rock that get increasingly
What would
more.
that look like?
I don't know, and it's kind of off the topic here because, again, that was
Well,
just a bad joke
It's
about the
not, because
illustration I
there's
had.
actually
Okay,
huge
well-
science literature on it.
Anyways,
We're not talking about fossils.
okay.
Talking
Yeah,
about
so am I.
created life.
Okay, well, go ahead, Brian. You can continue.
It was just a bad joke about the illustration. I'm sorry.
Okay, Campbell's progress, so
I'm
we
trying
got
to
it.
make my
All right.
jokes more
Anyway.
obvious. See, he got it.
Continue.
Yes. Thank you. All right.
Okay.
So the point is, at some point in the distant past, the first cell arose. So a functioning living cell capable of doing all the things that life does with DNA that codes for all its different parts. And over, what is it, like 2.5, 3 billion years, that's kind of all we had. It was just, planet bacteria, kind of like the inside of a bachelor's refrigerator.
Well, we had
And
we had the first prokaryotes about 1.5 billion years ago, but yeah, you still had bacteria for almost, it was a long time, over 1 billion years. So
yeah, the
a
timeline.
long time.
The timeline of life where you get from the first life to the Cambrian explosion is a whole lot of time before you actually get to that little where all the different kinds of things show up. So the way the tree is drawn here, you don't get any sense of that, but it's not intended to. I'm just saying it's interesting to actually take a look at it.
Okay, I agree. It is.
But somewhere along the line, so you start off, so just at this level, are you seeing my cursor if I point at things with my cursor?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, so at that point, there is only bacteria or things like it, some kind of unicellular things, and there are no worms or fish or lizards or squirrels or any other life anywhere on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
That's important to keep in mind. And then sometime in the future, there are worms. And then you have a planet that's got worms or something like them, and no fish, no lizards, nothing else. And then sometime in the future after that, there are fish.
So, are you familiar, for instance, with Ediacaran biota?
No. At least not by that name.
So,
Whoa.
the very first worms that we see in the fossil record, the annelids, such as Trichophycus, I think is one of them, appear in this period known as the Ediacaran, the late Ediacaran, which is the last period of the Precambrian, immediately preceding the Cambrian. And so what you get the little eukaryotes and bacteria, and they're doing their little cellular things for a long time. And then you get the very first, you get a lot of protists, and then you get branchings off of the first animals about 650 million years or so ago. And you get these little porphyrians and these basal guys. And so as you progress into the Ediacaran, into the late Ediacaran, you start to get these guys like all these weird groups of organisms that we really don't know where they fit in on the tree of life, like Charnia and what's Cyclomedusa, things like that. These really weird guys. We don't know what they are or what they were, but they kind of provide the ecosystem in which the first animals kind of branch out, like the small shelly fauna, which represent these groups of early animals kind of bridging the gap between the very weird and simple animals of the Ediacaran and the more complex animals of the Cambrian. In which
Jackson Nestlig is pleading to get into the room.
What? We've already got more.
Yeah.
He knows me. Okay, but Nestle, we've already got an extra person.
Yeah, I'm saying I'm an accident as it is. Sorry to interrupt.
It was mostly supposed to be between just Brian and me, really, the whole time. And so, I mean, if you want me to set up a talk between you and Brian, if Brian is interested, then we can probably arrange something like that.
I'd like to get through one conversation at a time before starting any others.
Absolutely. I agree. I'm sorry, but so, okay. So you get your Ediacaran guys, you get your small shelly fauna, and then you get your first hard-bodied creatures. And so go ahead, continue.
Right. The tree you see before you is not meant to be an exhaustive list of all the different steps involved.
I recognize
just meant
that,
to be very general. But I find that this topic is a little easier to discuss when you break it down into simpler terms. Because trying to delve into the minutia just gets you,
Well,
waist
I
deep.
I wouldn't exactly say it's minutia. I mean, if we're talking about there were.
Well, it has nothing to do with the point that I'm making, is what I'm saying. That, yeah, the fact that there's a whole lot of information on that yellow arrow between the bacteria and the worm is true, and I know that, but it has nothing to do with the fact that at some point,
Okay.
what was just bacteria evolved in some direction to get to worms and the first worms, right? So
right. I'll stop interrupting you. Continue.
it might make more sense later, I hope. I know where I'm going with it.
Okay. I'll stop.
So the point is that it's okay, So the point of this is just to sort of simplify the Darwinian tree of life, to show that you've got steps in the history of life on Earth wherein you've got just bacteria. And then something happened that caused the first worms to evolve. The first worms somehow over time gave rise to the first fish. And then the first fish gave rise to the first lizards, to mammals, primates, and then finally William Shatner. And with branches off here and there, as shown by the wolf and the cabbage. So this is my simplification of the Darwinian tree of life to sort of get the point across. So now, before we go any farther, I've had evolutionists tell me that the Darwinian tree of life is an old creationist song and dance that no real evolutionist believes. So is this at least in theory acceptable to you, or would you argue with even this?
With the tree that you're presenting currently?
Well, just the idea of it. The idea of the tree of life representing that, the history of life on Earth is one that goes from simple one-celled creatures to some kind of nematoids to some type of fish to some type of lizards, that's the gradual progression through time.
I mean, for one small set of organisms, sure.
Right. Again, I don't mean this to be all of it, because you've seen those illustrations that are supposed to show like all the different phyline classes.
Right.
It just looks like an insane spider web with a billion different lines.
I mean,
this is just a very simplified version of, if you go from us back to the first bacteria, what's a simple way to look at it?
Sure. Let's just say, for sake of argument, sure.
Okay.
Can I just put one comment in, a question? In your alternative frame, though, all of this is functionally simultaneous, correct?
Within the first week, in a general sense, yeah.
Okay, so have you defended that simultaneity for all the various pieces? Because all of that data would need to be accounted for, even the stuff that's not on your shorthand version.
I don't understand the question.
Well, for example, the lizard to mammal thing, we've got 100 million years worth of the reptile mammal transition. All of that data would need to be accommodated as to when it's supposedly happening. And have you attempted to do that?
I'm sorry, you're asking, when do I accommodate all the time between mammals, or between reptiles and the first mammal?
Yeah, how for example, do you
it's
accommodate
that yellow arrow between the two?
No. How do you account for the Ishigualasto formation and the Karoo formation and all of these supposedly taking place simultaneously, which they're taking place over a huge amount of time frame in the standard geology? All of them are functionally happening right during the flood, right?
Well, you're talking about different geological formations and different fossils or fossil sequences found in the rocks, which is, it's a side comment. Here's the thing, is that to the conversation that I'm directing this toward right now, that doesn't matter.
Okay, so
it can matter later. It can be something that's brought up later, but it has nothing to do with what I'm showing right now. And
okay, well, let's just get through the point you're trying to make right now. Let's just get through that part.
The short answer is that majority of the fossil record would be laid down during the flood, yes.
Okay, so
that has nothing to do with this.
So the point you're trying to make is?
The point is that I'm starting off with what I'm trying to represent is a basic understanding of the history of life on Earth according to Darwinian evolution. That we start off with certain types of things, and as we go forward in the future, new kinds of plants and animals arise that did not exist in the past.
Okay,
so
fair.
At some point there was the first fish. However you define that, there was, previous to that, there were worms and bacteria, but until that first fish, there weren't fish. It's not like there was a place in the ocean where you could look and say, oh, here's the first fish, and then in a different ocean there were already fish. I'm talking about absolute arise of the first of its kind throughout
the first population of what we would now consider fish. Right. Okay.
Right. So however you want to define fish, that was the first one. Does that make sense?
Okay. Fair enough.
So that's the kind of understanding that we need to have in terms of what Darwinian evolution is supposed to be. And so let me sort of bring up why that matters here. Are you seeing my screen, Phil?
Yes.
Hopefully Brian will talk about Cambrian chordates in that first fish thing.
Will be on you the whole time, Brian. So whenever you pull up a new slide, it just automatically goes up, and we can all see it.
Okay. I've got my laptop on, and it's showing it's just a little bit behind. Okay, so
yeah,
now you are seeing original fish and later fish. All right. So there's three different paths that the descendants of a species can take. So here's the original fish. Now, again, I'm going from the original as in the past on the bottom of the picture, and then going into the future by going up. Does that make sense?
Okay, fair.
So as you follow the descendants of this fish into the future, there can be a particular genetic line that goes extinct. There is a particular kind that came through whatever evolutionary changes become lizards. Mm-hmm. And then there are some that just become more fish. And even if they're different kinds of fish, they're still just fish.
Right, okay.
Does that make sense? So we've got three different potential paths. So this is one of those places where I point out that saying that evolution is change over time is insufficient, because extinction is a change over time. But it is not the kind of change over time that will cause original fish to evolve into lizard. Well, it will just make some line of fish go away. Well, so if we're trying to explain where lizards came from, we can't point to this kind of change. And that's why saying evolution is change over time is, while accurate, insufficient.
Well, we don't say, well, that's why most definitions, most dictionaries, whether you look at Wikipedia or Google or textbooks, the vast majority of them use the same definition, which is change in allele frequencies in a population over generations. And what this is simply attempting to do is, because evolution is all about genetics, is talking about how the genetics change from as you go from generation to the next. I mean, you can change over time isn't a good definition for biologic evolution. I agree with that, because I mean, cars change over time, whether you talk about new models being made or they rust, whatever. People change over time, we age, whatever. And so that's why we talk about alleles in populations, because evolution's about population genetics.
Do me a favor, for the people in the audience who might not be familiar with the terms, explain what is meant by changes in allele frequency.
So that's a fair point. So you have genes, and you have different versions of genes, and these are called alleles. For instance, think of there's one gene for eye color, right? I don't know if this is necessarily the case, but just imagine it is. And alleles of eye color would be brown, blue, and green, right? These are different versions of the same gene. They're all eye color, but they're just different versions. And so, so as you see the alleles, if you have a population where one person develops blue eyes and a whole population of brown, and blue slowly takes over, that's a change in allele frequency. So that's basically the definition that is most often used, whether you look at textbooks or Wikipedia or whatever.
Yes, no, it's a tremendously popular definition that's given. one is given, but that one fails for a couple of reasons. And since you brought it up, I guess we can talk about it now. Okay. So if you start off with original fish has a population of babies, and there's slight variations within them, as there are in any litter or a collection, whatever you call a bunch of fish. You call it a litter? What do you call a bunch of fish that have just been hatched? Let's call them a litter. So those changes can lead in one of three directions. They can lead to extinction. They can lead to some kind of change so that it becomes less fish and more something else, until eventually the descendants have to be described as a different species or different kind of thing, or it can just be different fish. Now, all of these would be a change in allele frequency. The extinction of one particular variety would be a change in allele frequency.
It's not, though. That's why you say change in allele frequency from one generation to the next, because if you have no generations occurring, you can't have change in allele frequency. You have no population genetics if you have extinction. So that's why extinction isn't
extinction would stop the changes in allele frequency, because you would wind up with 0% of whatever that allele
because
is.
No one's transmitting any genes anymore, so the evolution has ended.
Right, but when you get to 0, that's the ending point.
Okay,
but
you're not
before that, there were some members of the population that had that variation, right? However small it would have been. I mean, say that whatever that variation is, it starts out as 5% of the population. You go from 5% to 0%. That is a change in allele frequency.
Remember how in your video, the Epic Evolution Fail slideshow, you say that evolution is something to do with living things?
Yes.
Well, a dead animal is not a living thing, so evolution
Right.
has nothing to do with it. By your own.
Well, right. That's my point exactly. That's why the definition of evolution being change in allele frequency has to fail.
In a population over generations, you have to have those other parts. It's not just that they're changing in allele frequency, it's that it's in a population and these populations are continuously occurring. That's what evolution is. It's about population through time, continuously occurring.
Right.
Right. That's a very good definition, and that's why we use it. That's why biologists use it, because it takes such thing as extinction into account. That's why you say within a population that is continuing to exist. That's what that's about.
But changes in allele frequency doesn't demand that the population continues to exist. It only takes into account the frequency of alleles.
That's why you say in a population over generations, because the population is continuing to exist. It is existing continuously for generations through which the alleles are varying in frequency.
Right. So whatever variation that line on the left-hand side of the screen toward extinction had, it stops being a part of the population once it reaches extinction. They don't all just suddenly disappear overnight for the most part.
So when extinction occurs, they are not continuing to transmit alleles, right? Through the generations. Right. So it's not biologic evolution, because they are not continuing to transmit alleles through the generations. That's why extinction is not evolution. That's why the definition of evolution takes this into account.
Okay, but it hold on a second. Let me go back to my... according to this model, the Darwinian tree of life, more than 95% of all species that have ever existed have already gone extinct. Which means if you're going to press it to that point, you're saying that 95% of all species didn't evolve. Like that they're outside of evolution.
No, every species evolves, and that's
But they
I
went
do
extinct.
agree with. Yeah,
I think we're talking
over
past
99% of species have gone extinct, regardless.
Can I put in a summary point here? Every organism that has ever lived has a lineage of descent. Up until the time its lineage goes extinct, there shall have been an evolutionary history for it.
Right.
I'm curious about that original fish. Relate the data from the Cambrian chordates to this matter, please.
No,
Brian.
we're not talking about the fossils right now.
So
we're trying to define our terms so that we know what evolution is when we mention it.
So the point that he was making before we get to the Cambrian is that these things, every organism that exists has an evolutionary history up until the point that they go extinct. Then their evolutionary history stops because there are no more alleles being transmitted, no more genes, nothing. They're done. That lineage is completely eradicated. And so there is no evolution when extinction occurs. And that's why extinction is not part of evolution by definition.
Well, I get that, but extinction would still be a change in allele frequency. You would go from
Not
some
in a
percentage
population,
of population
over generations. That's what the definition is. It's not just allele frequency. It's in a population over generations. It's all three parts that are working together.
Right.
Okay.
And if
so
the percentage of a variation in a population decreases to the point where it gets to zero, we call that extinction. But it is still a change in allele frequency over time through generations.
Continue in the generations after the extinction event.
It doesn't matter.
No. Yes,
a change in allele frequency is a change in allele frequency.
Definitionally speaking, we are talking about change in allele frequency in a population over generations. If they're going extinct, then there are no more generations. There are no generations.
You've reached 0%.
So it doesn't. So it's not part of the definition because it's not over generations. They're not reproducing. There's no variations being inherited through the lineages. So extinction cannot be part of the definition. But this, I really don't want this one little fiddly bit to take up the entire time. So,
right. Well, let's just could we agree at least that the definition of changes in allele frequency as such doesn't work as a definition for evolution, as your definition has to add some kind of amendment excluding extinction as a possibility. that if someone says evolution is changes in allele frequency, you would say that's almost right, but it's not.
But that
That-
because,
Can
that
I
definition
use
doesn't
my
work.
definition,
Because it's
please?
not.
Natural branching, common descent. I'll shut up now.
right,
No, because
natural
that brings
branching.
us to the other line on the right side, where you've got common descent from a bunch of fish, but all of those are the result of the shuffling and dissemination of pre-existing genes in the original fish. Nothing has changed.
Not necessarily.
Well, in terms of this
for instance-
illustration, necessarily.
For instance, we actually have lots of examples of speciation events in cichlids based on their ecology and their phenotypic plasticity, and so we can see how they change and how they've acquired new characteristics as their lineages have split and gone their own separate ways and delved into their own different niches, and so they have added different structures and whatnot.
Well, yeah, but I mean, you have that within the dog population from Chihuahua to Mastiff, but none of that is the result of the creation of new genes and new genetic information.
Well, first of all, what do you mean when you say information? What is
I mean-
information? If we were to look at a strand of DNA, could you identify what part of it were information?
Well, certainly I can. I have a microscope. But how to explain it to other people? Information. Well, in this sense, I'm referring to particular genes. So a section of DNA that codes for a particular structure or function or behavior. I mean,
That's
the
information.
reason why
So a
DNA
protein
is information
coding-
because it codes for.
Okay, so a protein
has
coding
meaning.
gene is information.
Well, not just the protein coding genes. I mean,
So are endogenous retroviruses also information?
I would assume so.
So even though they don't do anything, they're still information. Are retrotransposons, which also often don't do anything, are they also information? Or pseudogenes, which often don't do anything? Because there are lots of parts of our genome that have no function.
Well, there's many parts we don't know have function yet, but at one point we thought 95% of our DNA was junk that didn't do anything at all, and now we know that a good majority of it does things.
Please don't tell me you're bringing up ENCODE. Please. Oh, no. Okay. Oh, my gosh. Okay. Okay, I want to make this quick because I had this conversation just the other day. ENCODE did not prove anything about about DNA. Their definition of functional was if something is transcribed, essentially it's functional, which is not a good way of describing functionality. To use an analogy, it's like saying, imagine asking me which part of a car worked, and then me pointing to the bumper and saying, "Oh, this part works because it's attached to the car that works." And you're like, "Wait, that doesn't make any sense. The bumper doesn't move the car." Like, well, yeah, but it works. That's essentially what's happening. It's like, yes, it's attached to the part that does the work, but it doesn't do any work itself. And so ENCODE used a really bad definition, although not technically wrong. They're not technically wrong when they say this thing is. If you redefine what is meant by functional, by biochemically functional, to mean this other thing, then within the system you invented, yeah, you can say that's functional, but it's not useful. It's like me saying that the bumper works because it's attached to a car that works. And so that's essentially what they did. And so, no, over 60%. I would say it's more than that. PZ said it was like, he said, when I said, I think 20% was being generous, that worked. So I'm sorry but
Okay, well,
it's a conversation I've had a lot.
Apparently read different things, and I didn't come prepared to argue any of that. So,
I'm sorry. It's just something I bump into a lot, and it's.
No, that's fine. I can tell you're passionate. That's good. You should be passionate about the things you care about and the things that you study. That's good. I'm not prepared with answers for it. Like I know I've read things about this that I would have to go look up because it's not the things I have memorized and read.
I absolutely encourage you to look them up. Go to Google Scholar and look up ENCODE. There's one. RJ or Ness, like one of you, what is it on the functionality of TV sets or something like that? Isn't that the name of the paper where they comb through what ENCODE looked at and just
There's a bunch of people that have criticized the ENCODE process largely because they were, as you pointed out, they were measuring only that something had been transcribed, not that it was actually used. And
Right.
in fact, we've known for a long time, most of the cell, every single gene is sort of quickly transcribed, and then most of it isn't used.
Right, because the introns and exons and all that stuff. Yeah. Good times, good times. But back to your point, Brian, about new proteins coming into existence, because again, we went on squirrel. But
yes, there's been a lot of squirrels in it. I didn't anticipate how many squirrels there would be.
I'm sorry, I go off on lots of
No, it's okay. I'm
tangents,
not
but
upset. I just was unprepared for the number of squirrels. I'm bracing myself. Squirrel it on.
in I think Nestle just provided the link to it. So in organisms, we have actually observed a lot of examples of new genes coming into existence through mutations. Fish are actually one example. You've heard of the antifreeze glycoproteins?
All right, hold on. I got to stop you right there. When you say we have observed new genes coming into existence, do you use the
Did I
word
say
observe the
observed?
way that you did? Did you not?
I said we have evidence of new genes coming, didn't I? Did I say observed?
I
Or
thought
did
you
I say
said
we have
observed.
evidence of?
That's an important distinction.
Yeah,
we have
you said observe, but it is
Okay.
fair to say we have evidence.
So we do have evidence of these.
Okay, if you have you
evidence
start off
of-
with the evolutionary dogma, then you have to say that everything is evidence of evolution.
Well, even within your
That's-
worldview, even within the kinds notion, these things had to have come about after they were created, unless God created every single species.
Right.
For instance,
There's a big difference between a variation on a kind that results from the shuffling, dissemination, or loss of existing genes and the result of something from addition of genes that didn't previously exist.
can I give you an
That's
example?
the point I'm making. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so one example, one that I've been reading about a fair bit recently, is these fish called notothenioids. They're a type of ice fish. They have one of the 5 different groups of antifreeze proteins.
Cool.
What they basically did was they repeatedly duplicated, of course not consciously, they repeatedly duplicated this gene that had a totally unrelated function. It worked in that it made a protein called trypsinogen in the pancreas for breaking down proteins. And so, or sorry, it made trypsin, which if I remember correctly, had a function in breaking down proteins. But regardless, the point is they duplicated this gene repeatedly, over and over and over and over again, and eventually it came to express a totally new function through those duplication events. Mutations accrued in it, and as it was continually duplicated, it came to express a new function, which was it made antifreeze glycoproteins, which are a totally new protein than the trypsinogen was, which have a totally new function than what the original trypsinogen gene did.
Okay, again, my question for you has to be, is this something which was actually observed while it was happening, or something which was read into the history of this species based on an evolutionary assumption?
So do you accept that
I'm not saying it
crime
didn't
scene
happen, I'm just saying
investigators- do you accept that crime scene investigators can figure out who committed crimes after the fact if no one saw the crime occur?
Yes, but I distinguish between that and observation. Being
I
able to piece
also
together
agree.
what has happened is not the same as saying I
Right.
saw it happen.
Right, I agree.
Okay.
And so when they do that, they didn't see it happen. They have no one who saw it happen, so they have to look at the available evidence. And in the case of the notothenioids, we can look at their genes and see the repeatedly duplicated and mutated copies of the protein. Wow, so you're putting a whole lot of stuff in the side. I wasn't.
Yeah, it's a long digression.
I'm not familiar with that one. I'm afraid, Nestle. But and so in this example, they looked at the duplicated genes, and they saw that you had this original gene and you have this new gene, and you have all these duplicated versions that are that link them.
Okay.
And so that's how they figured this out. So I mean, you could say God just created these guys with that, but that's not really an explanation. And also, especially since they're related to other fish, which I imagine you would consider part of the same kind. So even within the kind framework, they would have had to still have duplicates.
Yeah, no, the variation on the later fish tree there is enormous, and that's one of the things that again has to distinguish the actual biblical creation point of view from the sort of straw man cartoon version, wherein and I'm not saying that nobody's ever said this, but nobody in at least my lifetime has ever said that we think that every species that exists now, including the poodle, was created that way by God 6,000 years ago. It's that
No,
different
I'm aware
kinds
of
of things within certain. Well, I assumed you would be, but there's a lot of people who don't get the
So-
distinction.
May I ask, since you said there's a lot of variation, would you say that clownfish are related to perch, for instance.
I don't know enough about fish to tell you that, but
I mean,
certainly different kinds of fish can come from different kinds of fish. I mean, for instance, we have 400 varieties of dog and pet shop dog, and those probably all descended from some kind of ancestral wolf kind.
So would you say that for instance, two different groups of cichlids are descended from the same ancestor?
Certainly, it's possible.
It's possible, but
I'm not actually sure what the word cichlid means in this context or
so
in any context.
Cichlidae is a
Let
family
me put in a question. How many kinds are there? Let Brian answer that one.
17,112.
And who determined
Holy crap.
that?
I don't actually know that for certain. That's one of the approximations made by baraminologists. You can read about that at Answers in Genesis.
We have.
Okay, so that's one of the numbers I've heard, but it's a very new
And
science.
did you check how did you verify that those were valid analyses?
I took a poll. I asked the species. I was like, "Hey, elephant, how many kinds are you?"
So you're just kind of taking their word for it?
Well, I have nothing else to go on, and it's not really an important
actually.
part of my point. So
You do have a lot more to go on. When you do research on these things, instead of just looking at what the creationists say, you should look at the sources they're relying on.
I know that. I'm not saying that I have no ability to get information. I'm saying that right now, having been asked the question, I don't have anything better than last time I remember reading about it. That was the number I saw, but it's not something I've looked to in any kind of detail because it's not one of those things that I'm passionately interested about. Like, how many different kinds were there? I don't know, but there's other people who are interested in that and they're studying it. So,
and they don't know either.
Well, I mean, it's not. I mean, how many species are there? Like,
we actually have mechanisms, or we have models that look at and classify the species together.
Yes, but you also have conflicting definitions of what a species is, so it depends on who you ask.
Depends on what you mean by conflicting. They're different. They're used to different degrees. For instance, you can't use the biological definition of a species concept on the skeleton of an apatosaurus.
Well, I mean, just take dogs. Like, by one definition of dog, a Chihuahua and a Mastiff would be the same species because they're both dogs, Canis familiaris. But by a different definition, species have to be two different varieties of animal that can interbreed and have fertile offspring. And I don't think a Chihuahua and a Mastiff could breed without the Chihuahua being swallowed.
I think that I'm pretty sure if you tried to hybridize the DNA or whatever, then they would be able to. They're over 99%.
Well,
similar to over 99.9% similar to each other.
Right, I get that, but what can be done in a lab, and what happens if you put two members of the species or two different individuals together and not the same thing? And it's not my definition.
No,
like I haven't firmly settled on which one of those I use for a definition. I think species is one of those things that, frankly, is a little bit hazy because I've heard it used in different ways, and frankly, it's not really important to me.
Why it's hazy?
As long as they understand it.
Do you know why it's hazy?
Because people use it in different ways.
Well, sort of. It's hazy in part because life doesn't really care what we try to define it as. It's going to, if two organisms can mate, they're going to mate, and if that doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, and if it does, then it does, because there's a lot of genetics involved. There are prezygotic and postzygotic barriers that are running into each other, and so there's a whole lot of stuff going on. And sometimes you get more or less, you get fairly clear-cut examples, like the ring species. That's one of the things you get. Like the Incertina
species is a ring species because they've separated away from the main original species and can no longer reproduce with that original species. So some people would say, well, because they can't reproduce with each other, or at least they don't, it seems they can't, that we should consider those two separate species, and that's a speciation event.
Right.
Whereas other people would say, well, no, because they're so genetically similar, even though they don't, they could hypothetically, or we could potentially make them reproduce by combining their DNA. And so they are one species, they're just distinct variations on the species.
Also depends on how you use subspecies. Also depends on how you use subspecies. But
those terms are hazy because they're used different ways by different people. That's not an attack on anybody. That's just literally what I mean, is that different people mean different things and define it different ways. Which brings me back to my original topic, how the word evolution is used different ways by different people, which mean remarkably different things. But ta-da!
I gave you the...
I'm trying to bring it back transitionally here.
Ha ha ha.
Speaking of transitions,
Oh boy.
so the line.
Trust
Can
me,
I
when
get back to my illustration?
if you want to go into fossils, I am ready and raring to go.
No, I'm not looking to go into fossils. I'm trying to define what we mean by evolution.
Go ahead.
Okay, so give me your definition again. Say it again, because I want to. It's slightly different than changes in allele frequency. It's changes in allele frequency, something.
In a population over generations, you have to have continuous generations for it to be evolution. That's you get population genetics and mathematics like the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium involved and stuff like that. And so that's why you have to have continuous generations.
Right. Okay, so at what percentage of the population does it stop being changes in allele frequency?
I'm sorry?
Maybe I'm not understanding this right. So here's where I'm hung up on this, is that changes in allele frequency, just stick with that definition for a second, just that thing. Allele frequency is the percentage of a population that has one particular variation as opposed to another, or one particular allele as opposed to another, whether you're deciding to define that phenotypically or genotypically.
Well, genotype controls the phenotype, so.
Right, I understand. But I mean, the thing is you can carry a particular gene but not express it. So if you're considering phenotype, you're not necessarily considering genotype.
Precisely.
So those are technically two different considerations, even though we kind of talk about them as being one in this sense. And in a sense, we kind of have to, because you can't look at a frog and know what kind of genes it has. You have to do different work for that. Anyway, So the point is just in terms of changes in allele frequency. That is whatever percentage of the population a particular variation on a gene has as opposed to another. Are we on agreement there?
Sure.
Okay. So if you start off with, say, 50-50, you've got, let's say I've got 50% redfish and 50% bluefish. And then over the course of, let's say, 10 generations, the percentage of bluefish drops to 1%. Now, because there's still bluefish in the population, you would say that that fits within your definition of evolution. Yes?
I mean, we're considering the population as a whole, so yeah. I mean, they shifted away from.
But the fact that you're considering the blue ones and red ones together, you go from being 50% to 1% over the course of 10 generations. That is a decrease in their percentage. It is a change in allele frequency over generations. So we're in agreement there, right?
Sure.
Okay. So at that 10th generation, they are 1%. And so far, you would say that that fits your definition of what evolution is. But going from the 10th generation to the 11th, all of them die.
They've stopped evolving, yes.
So you would say that that change of allele frequency is no longer part of your definition of evolution, even though it is a reduction in the percentage of the alleles in the population.
Geneticists aren't studying skeletons; they're studying the living populations and how their alleles change over time. So, yes, you wouldn't, as a geneticist, you wouldn't be studying the fossils anymore, or you wouldn't be studying the population anymore, because there'd be no population to study. They'd be dead.
Right.
Why are you belaboring this point? I mean, unless you're going to argue that alleles don't ever change or that alleles can or cannot change, move on to a point that matters, please.
I'm just trying to understand the other position, because it's not a variation on that definition I'd heard before, and I'm just a little confused by how, or like when it stops being in effect.
It stops being in effect when the population is dead and is no longer producing new offspring who are passing down inherent variation. That's when it's over. That's when evolution's over, because you lost. You lost the game. You kicked out. So.
Okay. So the decrease in the population, as long as it remains above 0, is considered an evolutionary change, even if it fluctuates between 1% and 2% every year for 1,000 years. That's still evolution.
Genetic drift happens where you can model that with computer simulations and whatnot, where you just have alleles going up and down.
Suppose you're looking at your fish pond, and every year you take a count, and the bluefish are 1 to 2%, and one year they're 1%, the next year they're 2, the next year they're 1, the next year they're 2. They can be as small part of the population as possible, fluctuating back and forth between 1 and 2% year after year after year, and you call that evolution.
Oh, it'd still be evolution, yes, because there's still a living population transmitting alleles. So yes.
Okay. Here's my question. Would you then have to connect the lizard line and the later fish line into a single line? Because if what's happening is the population fluctuating between 1% and 2%, you can do that for billions of years and it'll never produce a lizard. But you've defined it as evolution.
What this is, what you have is a sort of phylogenetic tree. And so what you've got with that original fish is you have a population that's, we'll just say, since no one was there. And what we generally understand in speciation is that a population splits into, at least in allopatric speciation, and goes separate directions. And so these then over time variations accrue in these different populations, which lead to A, the lizards, B, the later fish in this example.
Right. I'm not intending to show that original fish gives birth to a lizard. Obviously, there would be multiple steps.
That's what I said. But that's what I was saying, is that you have this one population of original fish, which split into two, and they went down different directions, eventually culminating in lizards and eventually culminating in later fish.
Okay, but do you see how the fluctuation of the bluefish will never result in lizard?
It doesn't have to.
But you called it evolution.
Because it's changing allele frequency in a population over generations.
This is my problem with that definition, is that what I'm pointing out is that Darwinian evolution is attempting to show how fish evolved into lizards, answering the question, what is the origin of a species, or whatever you want to say lizard is, kind, class,
that,
whatever.
But that's something different.
Well, see, this is my problem with it, is that if you're going to use the word evolution to mean fish producing fish, producing fish, producing fish for billions of years, but you're going to say that's proof that fish produce lizard, I say we're talking about two very different things that should not have the same word attached to it.
Here's the question that I proposed in my video where I did a response to your Epic Evolution Fail slideshow. Do you think that the separation of species involves alleles? Yes or no?
Separate, you mean speciation, like
or the separation of one population into two species? Do you think that that involves alleles? Yes or no?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So, do you think that the alleles are varying in frequency through the generations, which eventually culminates in the different species? Not talking about lizards and later fish. I'm talking about just new species from the original species.
Well, again, it depends how you define species. I mean,
so you've got these two non-reproducing populations who came from an original stock. Do you?
Yeah,
would you?
We could take an example of different types of dog. Like I would say, it's probable.
Dogs.
Okay.
Enough with the dogs.
Okay, RJ's.
I know more about dogs than fish. I'm sorry.
Dogs are.
I know you were about fish.
Aren't real.
Up on fish. I love
dogs
fish.
Dogs aren't real. Dogs aren't real. Is what the point RJ's trying to make. There's an artificial animal. Right, we shaped and bred dogs.
Okay, wild dogs. I'm not talking pet shop dogs. Like,
well, we bred wolves and that eventually into dogs. The point he's trying to make is that this isn't, dogs aren't a good analogy because we, intelligent minds, looked at these dogs and selected for very specific traits.
No, I was going to talk about those existing in the wild, like African wild dogs or Siberian huskies, things that. Siberian husky that's a wild dog, right? I don't know enough about dogs to tell you where they live. I could bring up a map. I'm sorry, but there's different dogs that live in different parts of the world. That different, like African wild dogs and Mexican wolves probably can't interbreed, but we would both say they're under the Canis heading.
Well, no, African wild dogs aren't Canis. Canis includes dogs, wolves, the various species of jackals, coyotes, and dingoes. And probably a few others, but no, African wild dogs.
Then.
Well, it depends on what you mean by dog, because not all members of Canis...
There it is. It depends what you mean. I know.
Because not all members of Canis can interbreed with each other.
Right. Well, that's the point that I was getting to eventually, is that there's these things that we would all go, yeah, those are the dog kind, but they can't interbreed, so they're not the same species. But I would argue, and I don't think that I'd be that far from your point of view, that they might have all come from some type of, or at least many of them, I can't say all of them, but many of them could have come from some type of prior dog ancestor that then speciated throughout different environments, and different variations on them survived better because of the variations that were expressed.
And what is that process called?
Natural selection.
Exactly. So I agree with you.
Yes.
I agree. I do want to ask a question though.
Yes.
So, all members of Canis, even though they can't all interbreed with each other, are
Mhm.
indeed related to each other.
Right. I
And
would say
they're
they're the
also
same
related.
kind. That's
Okay,
what
so
the
they're
term
also
really
related
means.
to the African wild dog, the dole, the bush dog, even though they can't interbreed with each other.
And to their shame, the poodle.
Okay, so they're all related to each other, and also to foxes who have sort of cat-like characteristics. They're all related to each other.
I'm not sure about the fox, to be honest with you. As little as I know about it, I would say yes, but I don't know enough about foxes to
So-
say yes.
So even though we can show genetically that all these guys are more closely, that foxes are more closely related to wolves and your house dog than to anything else.
Okay, hey, if we got, some reason for it, sure. I'm not going to argue it.
So would you also say then that dogs are related to bears?
No.
So even though we have fossils of early, but actually Nestle just pulled it up. Even though we have fossils of dogs linked to bears, oh, this is just dogs. Nestle, you're falling behind. Get your game
You
together.
have a fossil that's linked to two different kinds of things. What you have is
Actually,
a
we do.
fossil that's interpreted as being
Do you
related.
know
to
why
two
they
different
interpret it
things.
that way?
Because they start off with an evolutionary assumption and they look
Do
at
you
something
know
that's
what they
supports that
look
assumption.
for? What paleontologists look for when they look at fossils?
Yeah, it depends what they're looking for.
They
I'm
look at
guessing teeth would be a big starting point.
that for mammalogists. Yes, if you're a fish expert, it might be a little bit more difficult. But or an entomologist. But for what they're looking for, are these things called synapomorphies. They're looking for derived characteristics, because when you do the genetics of different groups, already the genetics form them into these different groups. You show that humans are related to other primates, and then we're less closely related to colugos, and less closely related to tree shrews, and less closely related to rodents. And what we see is we have these synapomorphies. Oh, there you go. These synapomorphies, these derived characteristics, are getting further and further away from us if you're going away, or closer and closer to what we have, the closer you get. And so in this example, you have things like Amphision, which has characteristics of bears and dogs. You have early
Okay.
bears that are similar to dogs.
Well, crud, you got the platypus.
Well,
You can fit
platypus,
that one in a bunch of different categories.
no, it only goes in the mammal category. It has all the synapomorphies of only
It
mammals.
lays eggs and it fights crime with a cool fedora.
Early,
As
ma-
You
early
watch the right
mammals
cartoons.
did.
early
but-
mammals also laid eggs.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but are you in the process of answering the question I asked? Because I feel like we're going way off to a whole set of different topics.
So I do agree with you. The point I'm trying to make is I do agree with you when you say these share relatively close common ancestor. What I'm asking is, how far does this extend?
Before that, I had a question before that.
Which
Before
was
the dogs. That you are saying that the fluctuation of bluefish into 1% of the population, 2% of the population, 1% of the population, over and over, that is evolution.
yes,
When there is no possible logical way that can result in lizard,
it doesn't have to.
then why are you calling it evolution? This is my question.
And that's why I asked you earlier. So when these two things split, when the original fish split into the population that went towards later fish and one towards lizards, were alleles involved?
Well, that's why there's bluefish and redfish, because
Okay.
there's an allele for blue and an allele
So
for
the
red.
alleles were involved. Were alleles varying in frequency over the generations in that population?
Constantly, every year.
So we have both or all three parts, because you have allele frequency varying through generations in the population. So you have all
Right,
three aspects of evolution in that. Evolution is not in the definition attempting to explain the whole of the history of life. It's merely explaining the process that is responsible for the whole history of life coming into
wait.
existence.
Say that again. It's not trying to prove the whole history of life. It's just trying to say it again.
It's not trying to explain the history of life. It is trying to explain the process by which
Yes.
new species come into existence.
Thank
which
you.
is
That's
what,
where I was going with this next. Well
which is
said.
what grows the. Oh dear.
Okay, so here's a distinction that needs to be made. No, listen. You just said what I was going to say, so I'm about to agree with you. So
I guarantee we're about to disagree. So
well,
go
wait till we get there. Don't presume. Now, what you're seeing here is a picture of Mount Rushmore before and after it was carved. So that's what the mountain face looked like just because of erosion. And then, provided I hit the arrow in the right direction, here's what it looked like after it got carved. Are we following thus far?
Yep.
Okay. Come on, you're assuming I'm about to say something stupid that you've heard 1,000 times, and you're already.
I wouldn't say no.
Let me at least get it out before you decide how stupid it is.
I don't think it's necessary to call anyone says stupid.
Well,
I just want to put that out there first. I think I'm going to I'm going to use this as a pedagogical moment, as Google would say.
Okay.
So
here's the distinction that I am making. Do you see the pine trees? See these trees?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, they're sitting there growing next to the mountain. Now, in this picture afterwards, some of those pine trees are still there. So if you were to make a timeline of Mount Rushmore going from this cliff to this collection of presidents, these trees growing would be part of the history of that process, right? That over the course of however many years it took to carve these things, those trees were nearby and growing. That was part of the history of what was happening at the time it went from cliff face to president faces, right?
I don't understand what you mean.
I'm saying, however many years it took to carve Mount Rushmore, it went from. Oops, where'd my picture go? Sorry.
You're saying if it's the same tree or if it's the population of trees?
I'm saying that some of these are probably the same trees. Like this tree right here. Let's assume that this tree right here is this tree right here. Okay? So that tree was there, living and growing throughout the amount of time it took to go from just blank cliff face to presidential faces. Right?
Okay. Well, sure, why not? Let's say
Right.
it is.
Well, hypothetically, let's say it is. So if I were to say, what is the process by which this cliff face went from just a mountain with erosional features to the face of 4 presidents? It would make no sense to point to this tree and go, well, over the course of many years, this tree grew some, right?
Because it was completely unrelated and unconnected to the...
Yes, it is part of the history of what was happening during that time, but it is not one of the processes that explains the end result.
Because it was entirely unrelated.
Yes, entirely unrelated.
I think you're... Okay, continue.
Okay.
Because I'm very
the
confused as to
distinction
where
I
this
am
could
making,
go.
no, the distinction I'm making is the one that you just made, is the distinction between the entire history of all living things on Earth or the processes that cause life to evolve.
No.
Those are two different things.
It's not.
To pretend that anything that happens to life is evolution even goes against your definition, because if I can go back to fish, you said that extinction is not part of your definition of evolution. So it's an extinction would be something that happens during that timeline, but would not be something you would label as evolution because
it didn't meet the definition.
Right. So this is the point where we agree. Okay.
No, we don't agree here. We sincerely do not agree on what's going on here. So,
all right.
Okay.
Explain me why not.
So evolution is all about population genetics. Carving rock faces is not at all about population genetics, even analogously.
It's a metaphor.
Right. So what we're talking about, what the process of evolution seeks to explain is why new species come into, or how new species come into existence. Who cares why? It's how they come into existence.
Sure.
That we can show demonstrably, both in the field and in the lab, that the different parts of evolution are working together to produce new species, whether that be through mutation, natural selection, etc.
I'd say that's entirely wrong, but that's not.
It's not.
The point.
I can demonstrate actually. I can
Okay,
demonstrate all of it.
Okay, but I'm trying to make a distinction that you just made.
No,
And it
you
relates to
misunderstand the
definition
distinction.
that you gave me here.
You misunderstand the distinction. The distinction is that when I say change in allele frequency in a population over generation, that is not explaining in your diagram bacteria to worms, etc. This is explaining how the bacteria became worms, etc. That's what evolution seeks to do. Now, when you add in paleontology and phylogenetics, then you can see how all these groups are related to each other and how the process of evolution.
Yeah. Forget the whole paleontology thing. Just process versus.
I'm not talking about paleontology. I'm talking about how the process itself has resulted in different life forms.
Okay.
That's what this is about ultimately.
Let me ask you a pointed question here. Are extinctions part of the history of life on Earth?
Are they part of the history of life on Earth? Absolutely. And they can trigger adaptive radiations in other groups of organisms.
Okay. Are extinctions a process of evolutionary change?
No.
So we would agree that an extinction...
Not in a literal sense.
Okay, well, I'm being kind of literal at this point, I hope. We would agree that extinctions are something that, according to the evolutionary model, happened in the past, but cannot be said to be a process which causes evolution to happen. Right? Because when you say evolution is change over
Can I
time,
put in an observation here that's extremely relevant? That to the extent that a mass extinction event and those alone clean the deck of niches, that opens up opportunities which we see successful speciation increasing radically, as Niall
Right.
Eldridge has written about. That's the one
Right.
extent to which mass extinctions play a role in that, but they're
That's
not causing the mutations themselves.
right,
Sorry
and
for
that's
my
what. No, RJ, that's what I meant. They were causing these adaptive radiations, like whether you look at the extinction of the dinosaurs and you see the
well, no,
adaptive radiation of mammals,
you
or
can't use the word causative about an extinction. An extinction doesn't cause anything to happen.
yes, it
Like he
does.
just said, no, it
It
can't.
opens
You're
up
talking about things
niches.
going away.
Right,
That
these
doesn't
things
make
go
anything else.
away. If you
Right.
have a large, herbivore of group A, so you have this animal A, and it's filling the large herbivore niche, but something causes it to die off, and so now you have group B, which also develops, which now the niche of large herbivore is open, and someone else moves in to take that. That's an adaptive radiation that happens all the
But
time.
wait. This is an important distinction. The moving in to fill the niche is not what the extinction causes. It's what the extinction allows by opening up the niche. The extinction itself is merely that one variation dying.
I'm confused then by what you mean when you say cause and what you mean by allows to happen.
Well, it's like this. If I erase a chalkboard, I haven't caused any words to be written on it, but I've allowed there to be space for words to be written on it. The writing of the words means someone has to pick up the chalk and write words.
But
But I
natural
can't
selection,
say, I wrote that. No, I erased the board so that there's room for you to do the writing. But the process which causes words to appear on the board is a writing process, not an erasing process.
so natural selection is favoring these organisms who are now moving into this niche, and that's why they take over in the wake of the old organism. They have, in them dying off, they are not, of course, causing any mutations to occur.
Yeah,
It is now in nature. In nature, the organisms, because this was a niche that is possible to be exploited and is a very popular niche. That's why so many have taken it over.
Right.
Then these mutations in natural selection are favoring organisms who also move in to fill that niche, and that's where the adaptive radiation comes in. Of course, the death of one population isn't in and of itself stimulating mutations in natural selection. Natural selection is occurring in
that's
the
an
wake of it.
important distinction here, and this is one of those things that I see people get wrong all the time. Is it just gets talked about like everything that happens is this one single process. The extinction of something is the erasing of the board. It doesn't.
Oh, that's a
cause
bad
anything else to
analogy.
happen.
I got to jump in on that.
Okay, go ahead. Couldn't stop you if I
That's a
tried.
terrible analogy. That when the blackboard would be composed of a series of self-replicating words that are seething back and forth and constantly mutating and varying. The extinction erases segments of the board and leaves a mass of words already on there continuing to do their replicating. Now the words can move off in different directions that they might not have before because of the absence of some of the words. Do not for any moment think it's an erased blackboard. That's a bad analogy.
I'm sorry, but I don't think the distinction you're making is a necessary one. I'm sorry if you don't like my metaphor, but
the
metaphor is only meant to explain what it's meant to explain. So if you jump on the potential minutia of every possible way to interpret it, we're not going to get much said.
Well, that's why we should avoid using metaphors, I think. I think we should avoid using them as best we can.
You can't avoid using metaphors. It's the only way we can communicate.
No, we can talk about the data. We can talk about specific data points, in which case we don't have to involve metaphors.
Yeah, but, well, that's a whole nother... Even to explain why that doesn't work would take a couple of minutes. Look, let's get back to the point I was making here, because I think that we were in agreement here, because the last thing you said before I brought this up was that there is a difference between everything that happens during the history of life on Earth and what you would consider to be processes of Darwinian evolution or evolutionary change. Now, is that an accurate saying, or am I saying correctly what you're saying? That you were distinguishing between everything that ever happens to living things on Earth, which includes extinctions, and the processes by which things evolve, evolutionary changes, things that make a fish give gradual rise over many generations to lizard, something that would explain lizard. Whereas extinction is part of the history of life, just like the growing of those trees around the mountain are part of the history of Mount Rushmore. But the extinction of bluefish doesn't have anything to do with the processes that can cause redfish to gradually give rise to lizard, just as the growing of these trees are not part of what caused those faces to appear.
It might. One population going extinct might cause the other population
this
to...
is why I got to harp on the word cause, is that, again, something going away is not the thing that causes anything that's still there to do whatever it's going to do.
So what do you think happens? So when something goes away, one population goes extinct, and there's now this empty niche, what do you think happens to the other populations?
The other populations that already exist?
Yes,
what nearby, happens? Right. Yes. Well, if there's available resources, they physically move toward where they can get at them.
So how do they do that? They do it consciously?
Walking or swimming.
So do they do it conscious? If they can now take over this new niche, which is empty, which we know that happens, how do they do that?
I don't think I understand the question.
How do these other populations of organisms who are living in the environment where the old one died off, how do they invade this open niche? How do they do that?
They walk, fly, or swim over to where there's no longer the competition, but still the resources.
Okay.
And they live there.
But how do they become, if we're talking about, you had the one large herbivore, but everybody else is a small herbivore, how do you get members of this new population to become large herbivores again, like the old one was? Do you think that involves
how do you get them to be large herbivores?
Natural selection?
Hold on, I feel like we're changing topics rather drastically here.
It's not.
Well,
this is all.
Why would you assume that small herbivores are going to turn into the large herbivores that just went extinct? That doesn't follow at all.
There's evidence that such events have happened repeatedly throughout Earth's history, and so
I disagree with your interpretation of the evidence. So
you would have to present.
Regardless, why does it follow that they would?
Why does it follow they would? Because this is a new area for them to exploit.
Okay, but
it helps preserve their genes and pass them on.
Just to make sure I understand your metaphor or your hypothetical example, you have big herbivores and small herbivores. The big ones go extinct, and so the small ones move into the area and take over what was the niche of the big herbivores, right? Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that would not cause them to mutate into big herbivores unless there's something in the food that works with their existing genes to cause them to be big, and they were actually the same species to start with.
So what does cause them to mutate into big herbivores?
Well, see, now you're adding mutation on top of it. You just got one species went extinct, an existing species just moves into the area. They physically move from point A to point B, but now you're adding mutations on top of that. Why are you adding mutations on top of that?
Because mutations are always occurring, and they're going to be selected by the environment. The variations are going to be selected by the environment, and they're going to be beneficial or neutral or harmful.
Okay,
the environment's going to kick out the harmful ones and preserve the neutral and beneficial ones generally.
Okay, but here's the distinction that I made, that this went with your original definition, and you've sort of fluctuated back and forth as to whether or not...
I haven't. This is all the same definition. I'm still using change in allele frequency in a population over generations.
You've gone back and forth on whether or not you think extinction causes things to evolve, and here you've said that yes, it does, because if they go away and the new species moves in, and then they mutate...
Extinction, a population that's going extinct is no longer evolving. They are dead. They are gone. They cannot evolve.
No, I get that, but you're saying that because the existing species move in...
Yes, the surrounding organisms can move in to invade a niche that is now open because one population is now extinct. That population is no longer evolving, so others can move in to invade that niche. That's what I'm referring to. I'm not wavering back and forth on whether extinction is evolution, but extinctions can cause evolution in other groups, which is what adaptive radiations are.
You just use the word cause.
They can. If you have a niche, and this has been observed,
when a species dies. That's it.
I'm actually doing a whole lot of research on that very topic right now, which is adaptive radiations. Is throughout history, you have organisms, a group of organisms that have gone extinct, and then we see that natural selection has favored other ones who can go in and retake those niches for themselves, whether it's the therapsids dying off and dinosaurs coming in, or the dinosaurs dying off and mammals coming in.
This is nothing we've observed tens of millions of years ago.
What is meant by observation?
Observation is things we can see directly.
Can you see a fossil directly?
Yep.
Can you see its derived characteristics directly?
If you mean like teeth and bone structure and stuff, yes.
How do you determine
behavior and?
So how do you determine based on skeletons which organisms are related to each other? Can you do it by derived characteristics?
To related to each other? You
Yes.
would well, you put them into categories based on physical similarities.
So they're derived characteristics, right?
That's just the only way we can do it. But
Okay, so you're
you're going to go from fossils to assuming that you can tell the story of how one died off and the other moved into its niche and took over and then mutated. But all you have is bones. You don't have observations of populations moving from point A to point B.
Well, why do you think we have to?
Or any of that.
Why do you think we have to?
Because otherwise it's just storytelling.
So
You are inventing a fictional history based on what you think might have happened.
So, for instance,
That's
by
not
that
observation.
reason, we can never imprison anyone who wasn't directly observed committing a crime.
Wow, that's a big jump of logic I didn't
No,
make.
it's not actually. I'm using exactly that logic because if we didn't see it happen, we can't infer that it happened. If we find DNA of a criminal at a crime scene, is it reasonable to infer, even though no one saw it happen, that this occurred?
I just want to acknowledge that this is a Jurassic Rabbit Trail.
It's not. I'm making a point about your understanding of what observation means.
Can I jump in with an observation?
Ad absurdum that doesn't work.
It's not reductio ad absurdum. I'm talking.
No, it is. You're saying that you've just said that my point is we can never put people in jail unless we directly observe them committing the crime. That's not what I've said. That's not the logic I'm making.
We are talking about inferences in distant past.
The difference between observation and inference is an important distinction.
Are we making inferences when we read a DNA test that shows someone committed a crime? Is that an inference?
Yes. Wait, is the DNA test or the fact that you think they're guilty?
We can read the DNA test and we can see that their fingerprints were on the gun at the crime scene. Is that an inference or is that observation, even though we didn't see it, even though we never saw them hold the gun?
Well, the fingerprint is an observed fact. The interpretation of the fingerprint to match a particular suspect is an interpretation of an observed fact. And if it's accurate, it's a warranted inference.
Okay, so how do we determine its accuracy? How do we determine that?
Well, you match the fingerprint you found with the person that you found, and if you find enough matches, then it's the same person.
So by that reasoning, even though we couldn't see the person commit this crime, we have the physical evidence indicating that they did.
You know how drastically way off this is as a metaphor? I mean, that guy's gonna. I'm sorry. Is it AJ or RJ?
RJ.
RJ's gonna jump all over me for using a chalkboard analogy. You're gonna use crime scene investigation to say that you can look at fossil bones.
This is the exact same process.
And then talk about what kind of behavior patterns they had.
Yes, actually, we can do that.
That's why I wanted to bring in that point. Paleogenomics, don't forget paleogenomics, where they literally determine the genes that determine form and are able to retro-engineer extinct forms observed in the fossils. We don't have to guess at this. It's been done in the lab.
You're saying that we've got DNA from dinosaurs.
No, we're talking about things like
observe the genes of existing animals.
Well, we can also look at the genes of recently extinct
owls. Okay, lost me there.
No. We can use the DNA of recently extinct organisms like Neanderthals or stegodonts or mammoths and mastodons, and we can build.
I understand how all of this works. I'm sorry. I don't. It's 2:30, and I didn't want to do this for nearly as long as it's gone. I'm enjoying the conversation. I don't mean to be rude, but
I'm sorry. I don't know what time you want to go. Whenever you want to go, then we can cut the stream. If you want.
I absolutely got to go by 3 o'clock. But here's the thing: is that I want to bring this back to my original question, which is we start off with this is why I still have the fish on the board here. We have a population with two variations, redfish and bluefish. The population wavers between 98% redfish, 1% or 2% bluefish, and then 99% redfish, 1% bluefish. That is a change in allele frequency. The next generation, it goes slightly different. The next generation, it's slightly different, and that goes on and on and on.
Mm-hmm.
And according to your definition, you would call that evolution. Then the distinction I am making is that that is not the kind of change that will result in lizard. That's
Why
the
not?
kind of, because every generation has redfish and bluefish, and that's it.
So
There are changes in the allele frequency, but you never have anything but redfish and bluefish.
So how would you feel if I told you there are fish with hands in the fossil record?
It really
With
has
the
nothing to
same-
do with the example I'm giving here.
It does actually. There are fish with
No,
the
I have
arm
redfish
structure-
and bluefish. They don't have hands. They're just fish.
Okay. These are
One variation is red, the other is blue.
So in the example that you're given, I'm assuming that what you mean is that there is never any change other than they shift in the amounts of blues and red in a population, in which
There's just
case
a change in allele frequency every generation. Yes.
So yes, in your example, there's no change other than the frequency of these two colors. In that case, I would have to say no. You're not going to get a lizard from that because there is absolutely nothing else happening.
Right.
I would still call that evolution.
Okay, then
Because-
justify to me how you call it evolution when
Change
that's
in
all
allele
that happens.
frequencies in a population over generations.
So
Definitionally,
merely
that is
because
evolution.
that's your definition, even
is-
though it cannot ever result in the Darwinian tree of life, because you've defined it that
How
way,
does
you're
it
going to
not?
call it that.
How does it not?
You've just acknowledged that that fluctuation is a change in allele frequency over time
Do you know
through
what the
generations.
branches on the tree of life are? They're continuous populations that are still growing.
Right.
That's what the tree of life is. So if you have a population, as long as it's continuing, you're still growing the branches. You don't have to
Okay.
get anything major serious like a bacteria turning into a worm to necessarily grow the tree of life. You can there are still bacteria today. E. coli, etc.
Sure. We know
And-
more than 25,000 species.
They are growing the tree of life. I wouldn't say by any stretch of the imagination they're not growing the tree of life just because they're bacteria. And they, look a lot like bacteria
but
a billion years ago.
Stick to the example here. The example I'm giving here is a population with two variations, and every generation there is a fluctuation in percentages of alleles.
So in that example, I would say no, that is not going to give, at any point, they're not going to eventuate a population of lizards.
Right. Although
your
it
example.
does, right, but my example does fit your definition of what evolution is.
Yes, I would
Even
agree
though
with
we
that.
both acknowledge it will never result in lizard or anything else.
I agree, yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you understand my problem with the definition?
I don't see a problem.
Okay,
You
my problem.
assume the assumption inherent to your idea of evolution is that we have to keep making things different.
No, it's that we have to explain why things exist.
And
Why
we-
are there lizard?
And we do.
Why is
because
there fish?
when you're talking about the change from the population of fish to an eventual population of lizards, there are changes that have been worked out in extreme detail
Okay,
that
no,
are not
President,
just
you're changing
changing.
the subject. Listen, I'm sorry, it's past 2:30, and I'm not trying to be rude, but to be efficient. We're talking that the example that I have given, redfish, redfish and bluefish, every generation for 1 billion years, fits your definition of what evolution is. It will never answer the question, where did lizards come from? It is
doesn't
not the
have to.
kind of change. Okay, this is my point. This is my problem, is that Darwinian evolution is supposed to answer the question, why are there lizards? Why
And it
are there
does.
fish? And what your definition does is, it doesn't answer that question. It allows a population to remain exactly the same as created by God 6,000 years ago, never changing, aside from a little variation fluctuation. And you're calling it evolution when I'm saying that if it can't explain where lizards come from, it can't be called evolution. You're
As
just
I-
showing a percentage of fluctuation in already existing genes where no new genes are coming into creation, no new structures, functions, or behaviors. Fish of the same color in slightly different percentages for thousands or billions of years, if you like, That is not evolution.
So
that is not
this is the-
Darwinian evolution.
This is the point I was trying to make with the fish and the lizards. Lizards did not originate because fish varied in 2 colors. There was a whole lot more going on there in that
What?
chain.
Are you kidding me? I
No,
thought they just turned green and legs popped out.
no. There is a whole lot more going on on the level of genetics. I mean,
You
of
know, I
course,
wanted to
obviously
get
also
to it an hour and a half
morphological
ago.
change. But
I hope Brian can come on my show for us to thrash this issue out.
because what evolution does explain, like I asked earlier and you agreed, evolution or speciation does involve alleles and alleles changing in frequency over generations, which is precisely what evolution is. That's what evolution is. Now you have mechanisms of evolution that explain that change.
Let me clarify. I did not say that. I said that yes, evolution would result in a change in allele frequency, but every birth or death results in a change in allele frequency. Moving from one place to another results in a change in allele frequency. My point is,
over generations, continuous generations.
Right, I get that, but my point is I've given you a very simple example of how your definition can be met and never result in anything but the exact same species that you started with. And to call that evolution is, I think, misleading.
Why?
Can I jump in?
Because it doesn't answer the question of where anything came from. You cannot say that definition. I'm sorry, my example fits your definition, and it, you know, as much as you've said, there's change in allele frequency over many generations throughout time, and you can have as much time as you want, but it will never answer the question, where did lizards come from? In order to have an explanation for where lizards came from, Darwin was supposed to.
These 2 issues. You are conflating the fish that are just varying in their colors with the fish to lizard example. These are 2 separate examples. And
I'm pointing out why your definition doesn't work for Darwinian evolution.
Both the same process is happening in both. In both cases, you have allele frequencies varying over generations. In both examples, these are now what's happening in one is that you are acquiring, I guess, new structures and whatnot. In the other, it's merely varying which the percentage of colors in this population. The same thing is going on. The same thing is going on.
The same thing.
It is, and I can prove it.
No, listen to what you just said. In one population, you have the same variation over and over for generations infinitum. The other one is gaining new structures and functions and turning into a different kind of
animal. Does that involve change in allele frequencies in a population over generations?
No,
yes
the
or no?
question is that the same thing?
Does it or does it not involve change in allele frequencies in a population over generations? Yes or no?
Well, yes, but so does extinction until it happens, apparently.
Yes, it does. Exactly.
Yeah, but not merely.
It is the
thing,
same
it's insufficient
process. Now, we can talk about...
No, it's not the same process.
You see, part of the problem...
Blue fish to red fish will never create legs and lungs.
Part of the problem with this conversation is we haven't actually touched any data. If we really want to have
the data is how you're going to interpret the data through the lens of what
data
you already
doesn't
believe when you
matter.
get there. Not to this part of the conversation.
I'm trying to get to
it. Does. Please come on my show.
Listen. The reason why the data doesn't matter right now is because it doesn't matter what fossils you throw in here. I'm trying to make you see the distinction between fish not changing, but the variation of what already exists fluctuating back and forth forever, and the creation of new structures and functions, which means a creation of new genes that did not previously exist.
Brian,
because whatever genes it takes to make legs and lungs for a lizard, the fish doesn't have that. You can go red and blue forever without creating new genes. You can't become a lizard without adding new genes to the fish population.
Which is precisely why we have to get off the metaphors and actually look at the data. We can't use metaphors.
It's not a metaphor. It's a matter of definition.
Evolutionists argue about what is occurring in evolution. They're not saying, oh, it's like this. It's like people paddling in a kayak, to use Richard Dawkins' analogy. It's not like people paddling in a kayak. I mean, on one level, on the metaphorical level, it sort of is. But when we're actually looking at the data and we're trying to actually understand what is occurring here, metaphors are insufficient. The point I'm trying to make is when we go from that original fish to the lizard, there are a lot of changes occurring that are ultimately just the result of these changing allele frequencies as the alleles come into or go out of existence.
Logically cannot be. It is illogical and impossible to say that that's all that it is. Because
ultimately it is. That's it. Ultimately.
Let me throw out something and see if you can agree with this at least. that whatever genes it takes to make legs or lungs, the lizard has them and the fish does not. Can we
Not
agree on
true.
Some
that?
fish do. Some fish did actually,
Okay.
Yeah, so
and some fish still do. Or no, I guess coelacanths they still have. They have the lepidotrichia, so they don't really. But actually, there are a lot of fish in the fossil record that do. Eusthenopteron, Pandorictes,
Do you
Tiktaalik.
not realize you're changing the subject drastically to try to
No,
argue?
No,
with
I am
me?
fitting. I am making a comment
No,
on the
you're-
point. When
You're
look, again,
arguing
this
just
is
to argue. Listen.
no. Okay.
Take an
Has-
let's go back in the fossil record as far back to the first fish. Did it have the
Which
genes
was
to
that?
create legs and lungs?
Which fish was that?
I don't care.
It
Just-
matters. So
Okay,
the first fish.
Are you really going to argue that the first fish had legs and lungs?
Did it
Or-
have homeobox genes?
I don't care. Listen, are you going to say that the first fish in all of the world already had the genes for legs and lungs that would
Are
eventually
you
be
saying
used in the lizard, or
homeobox
it didn't?
genes are not part of the process of making legs?
I'm saying I don't care right now. You're getting off the
You
topic
don't
and
care
trying to
about the
change the
data.
subject.
Thank you, Brian. Goodbye.
So Brian.
I mute now.
So Brian, the first fish. Well, when we say the first fish, fish is a non-term really in taxonomy, but we have these early Cambrian or early to middle Cambrian chordates like Hycoichthyes, which do not have legs. They look a lot like lancelets, which is what we predicted which is what evolutionists predicted given what they knew about phylogenetics at the time, and they were correct in that prediction. It's exactly what we found.
That's a bold declaration of faith, but obviously one I disagree with. But the point
I can demonstrate that that's what happened. If you read, for instance, Richard Owen's.
Yeah, I can find you pages of predictions that have been falsified by evolutionists themselves. That's why trying to go off on rabbit trails
evolution that were
about the data
falsified?
doesn't matter.
Within
How about
evolution, that were false.
Tiktaalik, that was the example of fish growing legs. We found the fossil. It's exactly what we predicted. But then we found footprints that were dated at 50 million years before that, and so it didn't matter anymore.
It wasn't 50 million. It was
the evolutionary sources that I've gone to say don't use that anymore. It's no longer valid.
Hold on.
I can find you phylogenetic trees from evolutionary sources that no longer listed as being the progenitor of legged animals. It's been taken out.
Well, no, it's not the direct.
It doesn't matter.
No
It's
one
not
ever
the
thought it
point
would.
I make.
Actually, it does. So the footprints actually. There's actually still a lot of controversy surrounding them.
No, forget the footprints. I'm sorry I brought it up. I'm just saying that that you can go down one rabbit trail, and I have a parallel rabbit trail.
Just bring up data and say it doesn't matter, and off to the next subject.
yeah.
Because it's just a rabbit trail off the point I'm trying to make here.
Look,
The point I'm making is, look, fish, does it have the genes? The first fish, go back to your lamprey, whatever. Does it have the genes for legs and lungs? The answer is no.
it had homeobox genes, which would eventually become co-opted to make limbs.
Okay, so are you trying to argue that the very first fish to evolve already had the genes that could make legs and lungs?
It had homeobox genes. Well, lungs are a different story, but for limbs, it had homeobox genes, and homeobox genes are what pattern vertebrate development, and so that's what we use to get these in our legs. So that's what it was co-opted for a new function.
By which you mean changed over many generations, or stayed exactly the same, and that's why lizards had legs when they eventually went up to land?
It changed in allele frequency and populations over generations. I can tell you that. But
I knew you would.
Yeah, I'm showing a picture
No,
from
you
an
said you muted
article
yourself.
now, so
You
you
said
can
you
look it
muted
up yourself.
he did. Okay. So yeah, there's a picture. So
All right, I'll look at the other computer.
fish with the limbs. So ultimately, yes, it does always come back down to changing allele frequency in the population over generations. Whether you are getting something from fish to tetrapods, or fish to yet more fish, regardless, you still got evolution going on. And I mean, I know you don't like that definition, but that's the
No, I feel like
definition.
here's the thing. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be rude. I'm trying to
you're fine.
understand
Go
where
ahead.
the disconnect is. I feel like I have explained why that definition fails, and I
haven't.
don't understand why you're not understanding what I'm
I've
saying.
watched your defining evolution series. It's really not an explanation. It's more of, I don't really like this definition, so I'm not going to use it, when this is a perfectly satisfactory definition, and I have explained that this is precisely the process that is going on in these in the branch from the fish to the lizard
Okay.
and from the fish to later fish. It's the
Well-
same thing going on whether there are new alleles popping into existence, which
Okay,
again
hold on.
changes the frequency, or you are changing the frequency of existing genes.
Are you then? Hold on. I had it like formulated as a sentence in my head, and then I rabbit trailed.
Brian, will you appear on my show? Because I know you are going to have to go.
Yeah, you're gonna have to go in like
I'd
15
love
minutes.
to explore this stuff at more length, and I think it's a subject that will be usefully explored at more length. So, can you appear on my Evolution Hour at some stage in the future?
Ouch, RJ.
Send me an email, and I'll think about it.
I'll give you a email, RJ. I got you
Okay, I'll
covered.
have to get your email to
Okay.
to communicate with you.
I'll give it to you, RJ. Don't worry about it. So,
Man, I had it like you hit the point, and then you kept talking, and my brain was like, "Oh, I'll follow it." And see, this is what happens when I listen to other people talk. I forget what I was thinking.
well,
That's me trying to be polite, but it doesn't always work out for trying to follow my
really, the point
thoughts.
I was making is that regardless, you've still got even if you have a new allele coming into existence, that's still a change in the frequency.
Okay, hold on. That's it.
Okay.
Do new alleles come into existence because of a fluctuation in the percentage of already existing alleles?
You have mutations that occur in alleles, and that generates new ones.
Okay, there. Wait. Are mutations the same thing as a change in allele frequency? Are those synonyms?
No, I didn't say they were.
Okay. Does a change in allele frequency by necessity imply that mutations are happening, or is it a separate process?
Well, you're necessarily getting variation and mutation because we're imperfect, and so that's part of the that's
Listen
it's
to the question.
incorporated
Listen to
into
the
the
question.
alleles.
Is the concept of changes in allele frequency, is it, on your definition or understanding, does it necessitate the involvement of mutations, or are mutations a separate thing from changes in allele frequency?
I can clear this up. I can clear this up real quick. The definition of evolution is
Wait, hold
a
on,
change
who's
in
that?
allele frequencies. Oh, sorry, it's me.
Who?
The definition is the change in allele frequencies, but there are different mechanisms for why this happens. One
Right.
of them is natural selection, another is mutations. There are more than one ways for the
Okay,
frequency
here's-
change.
So here's one of the points that I wanted to make, is that the change in allele frequency and a mutation that causes a change in allele frequency, that's a cause and effect relationship, where the mutation is the cause and the change in allele frequency is the effect.
That does
Right.
happen, yes.
Okay. So this is one of the points of distinction that I think is important to make, is that a change in allele frequency is an effect. It's not a cause.
No one ever said it was.
Okay, but the whole thing I'm trying to get at is that I think evolution should be defined as the process by which a particular existing kind eventually gives rise to a different kind.
Well, you'd have to define what a
Yeah.
kind is.
And that goes
Right, I
against
get that, but I mean-
that goes against the
Make it
law
as
of
simple as fish and
monophyly
lizard.
for evolution.
I'm sorry, the law of what?
The law of
Monophyly.
monophyly.
Sorry, you both said it at the same time and I couldn't understand it.
Monophyly. monophyly. Monophyly.
Okay. So, but to just go to my cartoon example here, to go from original fish to lizard, to explain why is there lizard, you need a cause, a process which causes things.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas it sounds like we just agreed that the change in allele frequency is a result of whatever the cause would be.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, the creation of new genes because of mutations would be the cause, but the change in allele frequency would be the effect of the
The
cause.
mechanisms of evolution do. Yes, they further evolution.
Right, but see, so the point I'm making is that to say that changes in allele frequency is the process by which things change from, say, fish to lizard, is
No,
saying
that's
that
involved. I said repeatedly that's involved. Not that is in
right,
and of
but
itself.
extinctions are involved too. We agreed on that.
Okay.
Let me put in a creation-focused question here that will maybe help
Okay.
clarify the thing. The line between original fish and lizard, defend the proposition that all of the steps in that are not monobaramenic.
Oh god.
Do you understand what I just asked?
Not really, no.
I don't think
So
he
a
did.
Barrowman
You know
is a
what a
created
Barrowman
kind.
I know what a Barrowman is.
Okay.
So you don't read baraminology literature?
I've read some of it, yeah.
Well, if you had, you would have known about monobarramin. For example, the entire horse sequence from Heracitherium to Equus is established in creationist literature as a monobarramin.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Okay, so can you defend the proposition that the line from original fish through all the physically known fossil intermediates through to lizard are not connected by a series of monobarraminic steps?
Sorry, it sounds like you're asking me to use a creationist interpretation of an evolutionist.
No. I'm asking you for a creationist interpretation of the actual data. Now, if you're going to argue that most of the data doesn't matter and you're not going to pay attention to it, then that's understandable, but it means you're not on the field. We've got to discuss this on our show because it's too much to do here. But I'll mute now.
Right,
Hope you can come on my show.
Yeah, I've heard that before. You'll mute now. You keep saying that I'm saying that the data doesn't matter. I'm not saying the data doesn't matter. I'm saying that before you've defined what evolution is, it doesn't make any sense to go, well, before we define what evolution is, let's see if we can see if these are examples of evolution. Let's look at the fossils and see if they prove evolution.
What evolution is before we went to the fossils. Before we start talking about
you interpret
biology.
the fossils according to your definition of evolution. And that's the worldview you bring with you to the fossils.
Again, do you know why people classify fossils as certain groups?
Yes, I understand that.
Because of shared characteristics.
Yes, I get that.
The question is, why should we include some who have the same characteristics in one group, or why we should include them as being related to each other, but not others in your worldview?
Well, here's the thing is that ultimately, whatever group you put things in, either you're right or you're wrong. Like, is the fox truly the same kind as a wolf?
Okay.
Well, does it have the same ancestor? Do you go back and find that if you follow that bloodline backwards, you wind up at the same ancestor as the African wild dog? If so, they're the same kind.
So, can you do that with bears also, like we mentioned with Amphision earlier?
Okay, again, I don't know. I would suspect no from what I know about bears, that they're physically and genetically different enough from dogs. But here's the thing is that, again, that's why I start with the Darwinian tree, is that in order to distinguish evolution as evolution, you have to be able to connect those lines between every two living species that have ever existed. And to be able to say, well, we can prove that the fox and the wolf have a common ancestor is not the same thing as to say that the wolf and the cabbage have a common ancestor.
I'm not so sure there's a huge difference. Either way, you're looking at these genetic mechanisms that are occurring. In one case, it's relatively recent past, and in the other case, it's the
right. But that's why you have to
distant past.
define your terms of what it is we're talking about. And this is why your definition of change in allele frequency, it's important to understand and distinguish between what it is and what it isn't. Because ultimately, we've agreed that it's an effect and not a cause. That if there are mutations, if there is genetic drift, then there is a resulting change in allele frequency. But then change in allele frequency is what causes that change from fish to lizard.
Well, I didn't say it's what caused it. I said it's what is involved in there. Change in allele frequency in a population over generation. That is involved in the whole process, from that original fish to that lizard. But you have mutations and natural selection, other mechanisms.
Which is why I brought up this, because what you've done there is you've now said that the
why we shouldn't bring up
the change in allele frequency and the extinction are both things that are part of the history of life on Earth, but they're not part of the process that explains where different kinds of plants and animals
mutation and natural selection are very much part of the process by which new fish and plants and whatnot are.
Okay, we weren't talking about those though, were we? We were talking about change in allele frequency, which is the definition you gave,
which is what's occurring. So natural selection, mutations, etc., are causing the change in allele frequency. Right?
Okay, even given that, change in allele frequency is not causing the change. It's a result of the change.
It was. That is the cause. It's happening the whole time you're going from one to the next. It's happening.
Right, but it's
the very fact that they're changing in allele frequency, that's not what's causing this.
Jackson, the change in allele frequency is census information. It's just counting. It is not a process that would turn fish into lizards or anything else.
It is a process, because the process of changing allele frequency involves reproduction and passing on genes,
Those are
etc.
the causes that result in a change in allele frequency. You can't switch the place of cause and effect. The
We're not
change in
doing
allele
it.
frequency is the result of whatever changes happen, but they aren't the changes. They're the census information that you find out by counting noses after the fact. The fact that there's a different number of blue fish doesn't make the blue fish turn into orange fish. You're just counting them.
No, what causes
just
that is mechanisms of evolution, and those are going to influence the allele frequency.
Yes, that's my point exactly. That's it. That's what I'm getting at.
That's what we've been saying this whole time.
No, you haven't.
That's literally the
define-
exact same thing we've been saying for
No,
Yeah.
because
at
your
least half an hour.
definition. Listen, your definition of evolution was changes in allele frequency through successive generations, but
Yes.
you just said just now that
That's
that's
still
not
happening.
what causes things to change.
I didn't say it caused it originally. I said that's what's happening.
Yeah.
That's not what's causing it. Nothing has changed. We're still hammering the same point. But I'm glad we agree
Yeah,
now.
You know the causes are called the mechanisms of evolution,
Right.
not evolution itself.
Right.
Okay, but by that, these trees growing caused Mount Rushmore.
No.
That's what
it
you're
didn't.
saying.
No,
No, not even
Yes.
close.
Extinction is part of evolution because it's something that happened while other things were happening.
No. Is extinction change in allele frequency in a population over generations? No. Is natural selection
It could be the result
Causing-
of it, though.
is natural selection causing a change in allele frequencies in a population over generations? Yes or no?
Well,
Is it
yes, but
So,
every
natural
birth
selection
and death.
by definition, a mechanism of evolution. Do mutations cause a change in allele frequency in a population over generations? Yes or no?
They can, yes.
Okay. So another mechanism by which evolution occurs. And we can go through all the other ones because they all do that. Ultimately,
Right,
that
but
is
you're
what
using a
this is about.
definition that doesn't work, and I think you've already agreed with that multiple times. This is why I'm confused.
I haven't changed my stance
You
at all.
have. You've gone back and forth. I'm going to have to download and edit the 3 hours of this, but you've both said
It's only
that
been 2
changes-
hours. What are you talking about? We
well,
could go on for
it's
another
time
thing.
change to a different state. No, that defining evolution to be changes in allele frequency over generations doesn't explain this. Okay, it doesn't answer the question, why are there lizards? Because in order to answer where did lizards come from, you have to include something entirely outside of changes in allele frequency over
Does-
successive generations.
Speciation involve a change in allele frequencies in a population over generations? Does speciation involve
It
that?
doesn't matter. If you
It
take
does
a fish
matter, yes or
and you-
no?
doesn't matter.
No,
Yes or
it
no?
doesn't
Does it
matter.
involve that?
It doesn't. You're not
So-
answering the question.
So
Where did
for
lizards come
the,
from?
for the audience, we have, this is not answering the question. Does it involve, yes or no, a change in allele frequencies in a population over generations? Is that
so
what's
does
occurring?
extinction.
No, it's not, because it's not occurring over generations. By,
Not after the
defi-
extinction.
by definition, an extinction is not evolution.
Yeah, I
Now,
still think that's
Is the
right. It's
speciation
an
event?
arbitrary.
It's not arbitrary. This
It is
what-
arbitrary because an extinction is a change in allele frequency. You go from whatever percentage it
Over
was to
generation.
zero. That
Over
is a change in allele frequency.
Brian,
After that, it stays zero, so it no longer changes.
Because
After
it's
the
not
extinction,
evolution
it no
anymore.
longer changes.
It's not evolution after the extinction event. It's evolution up to the extinction event, but not after.
notice that in the definition it
Right, that's what I've
includes
been saying.
it includes populations. If you,
Right.
if
Okay.
something is extinct, you don't have a population anymore.
It's also about 3 o'clock. Brian, if we all want to shut the stream down, and then we can pick this back up another time.
Somebody points out in the live chat to make sure that if this is mirrored, that it be kept intact, not edited. I think that is an excellent thing because all information and discussion should be there for everyone to observe.
James?
So, are we ready to hit the stop broadcast, everybody?
Can I first be told who the third person is that I keep hearing?
Oh, that's Nestlig.
Nestle?
That's me. That's
Hi,
me,
Nestle.
sorry. Hello.
I never got introduced. All of a sudden, there's another voice, and I was confused. I'm like, either Andre's doing
He
a
said
good
he was
accent.
going to be silent, that he couldn't talk to us.
Sorry. Sorry.
Anyways, it's okay.
Oh, he's the Sith Lord, I see.
anyways, I think it's 3 o'clock now, so we're gonna stop the broadcast. Is that okay, everybody?
Yes, I would appreciate that. I was hoping to get a little farther down the conversation trail, but this was interesting, if nothing else.
Well, you can go on RJ's channel and if you want and talk with him.
Yeah, I will love to
He does a
discuss
show
map
on
of
Wednesday.
time with you.
He does a show on Wednesday at 7 our time, Brian. And so if you want to talk about it with him.
And I can theoretically arrange a different time if it's something more suitable. I mean, it eventually ends up on YouTube, so it really doesn't matter.
Just send me an email and we can talk about it.
Okay. All right. I'll get you two in touch.
Mm.
But at any rate, it's now 3 o'clock. And so I want to say, Brian, thank you for coming on. I do really
Thanks for
appreciate
having me.
I do really appreciate you coming on, talking with us. And it was an interesting discussion. Thank you. Thank you, everybody in the live chat for being there.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for hanging in with us.
Yep. Thanks, RJ Nestlig. All right, everybody. We'll see you later. Bye, everybody.